Today, guys, on Beer Geek Nation, I'm going to do a frequently asked questions for two of probably the most watched videos on the channel. The one being making a yeast starter for your homebrew, and the other being harvesting yeast from a homebrew that you've already fermented out to be able to reuse it. I got a lot of questions and comments in these two videos, and they tend to be, similar questions. So I'm just going to answer kind of a general kind of answer to a lot of those questions. And if you guys haven't seen those videos yet, just, click the links on the screen right now and watch them and come on back. So with that said, let's get right into it. I'll address some questions first with harvesting the used yeast already. And the main question, although I get a lot, is how long does the harvested yeast actually hold up in your refrigerator after you have actually harvested? I would say up to 6 months. After 6 months, it starts to get a little bit sketchy, but I have used stuff that's been like a year old. You just are gonna absolutely make sure that you do make a yeast starter if you're going to use stuff that's over 6 months old. So I would say, 1 to 3 months is ideal. You really wouldn't have to make a yeast starter with that stuff. Anything after 3 to 6, it gets a little gray. If you're making a bigger beer, if you're, it's a higher gravity beer, you might want to make a yeast starter with it. Anything after 6 months, you're definitely going to want to make a yeast starter. But I would say max life on these things is up to a year with a yeast starter, but you should be fine up to a year. The other question I get a lot of is how many of these jars do I actually use per batch of beer? Typically, I will just use 1 jar per batch of beer. If it's a higher gravity beer, I'm going to make a yeast starter with one of these jars. If you guys didn't want to make a yeast starter, you could pitch 2 or 3 of these, if it's a higher gravity beer. But honestly, one of these jars is going to handle a pretty hefty beer. I mean, I'm talking 1.07, 1.075, somewhere in that range. One of these jars, because there is so much yeast in it, and it is, already basically an active yeast strain, will ferment out pretty well. But a bigger beer, depending on how old the actual, jar is itself, you might want to make a yeast starter, but you can pitch, 2 or 3 of these if it is a higher gravity beer. But really, you're only going to need 1 if it's a, a medium to low gravity beer. Anything higher, just pitch one of these into a yeast starter. And the final question that I get all the time about reharvesting yeast is, do I decant off any of this beer in the jar, or do I just pitch the entire thing in? I will decant off. You can see once these sit in the fridge how clean and clear they get. So usually I'll just decant off half of the jar. And then just put, then just swirl the rest of the yeast and the trub and everything up with the beer and just pitch that in. I've never gotten any off flavors from the beer in here. There's not enough beer in here to really affect a beer that you're pitching it into, so don't worry about that. But typically, because it is such a packed level down there, I'll decant off half, swirl the rest up, and pitch half into the actual beer itself. Real simple. Yeah, just don't overthink it. I mean, it's really not going to affect the flavor all that much. All right, so the next set of questions is about the yeast starter video that I did, and I get, not too many questions on this. I think it's pretty straightforward, but I do get 2 big ones all the time, and probably the most, asked question I get on this video is, how long do I leave the yeast starter on the actual stir plate itself, or how long in advance do I actually make the yeast starter before I brew? Typically, I will do a yeast starter the day before I brew a beer. So, you're looking anywhere from 12 to 18 hours. I just make it up the afternoon before, before I go to work, before the night before, if I know I'm going to brew in the morning. So anywhere between like 6 to 12 to 18 hours before I'm actually going to brew the beer. How long do I actually let it sit on the stir plate? Basically the entire time. There's, you can leave it on as long as you want. I wouldn't do anything less than, 4 to 6 hours. I would say 6 hours would be the minimum amount of time you're going to want to start to make a yeast starter. Typically, I do, like I said, 12 to 18 hours, but I wouldn't do anything less than 6 hours. Then it's starting to get, kind of pointless. Yeah, so I mean, really the easiest way to do it, the thing I get into the habit of doing, is actually just making the yeast starter the night before, put it on the stir plate, and it's ready to go the next day. That's really the easiest thing to do. But again, you can get away with a 4 to 6 hour one. It's just not going to be, as viable. But you know, it's really up to you. And the other question I get a lot, and it's kind of a weird question. I'm surprised it actually comes up, but in the, I believe it's the Yeast, the slap packs, you know, they have the yeast nutrient in there, which is generally what I use. I get asked, do I put the yeast nutrient from the yeast packs in with the yeast starter? And to that I say absolutely. I guess there are some people who don't smack the pack and just use the yeast and just leave the yeast nutrient out to have yeast starters, but I really don't see any point in that. I mean, you might as well give that yeast, you know, the best possible chance to propagate and to be, you know, healthy. So I smack the pack, shake it up, let it sit there for a while, you know, an hour or so, let it get to room temperature, and then I'll pitch it into the yeast starter. I see absolutely no problem with putting that yeast nutrient in there. So I hope that clears up a lot of the questions you guys seem to have, and definitely check out the videos if you don't know what I'm talking about with this stuff. And if you have additional questions, maybe I'll do another follow-up to, you know, if I missed something, but I think I covered the big one. So with that said, guys, remember life's too short. Drink amazing beers. Cheers.